Welcome to Decoding Leadership, where we break down the elements of humane and effective leadership. I'm your host, Jade Rubik. We knew each other from working together for many years at New Relic. After we went our separate ways, you two went off and co-founded a company called Reclaim. For those that don't know about Reclaim, can you just tell us about what this company was doing?
Yeah, I can start. The genesis behind Reclaim and why we started working on it was somewhat based in our shared experience in two fundamental issues that we noticed and observed over the years. One was this very personal, professional problem of the stuff on my calendar doesn't match the things I'm actually trying to get done. So I have my actual priority list and my to-do list, and then I have my calendar, which is like a debt I have to go pay down so that I can get my real work done. It was broadly difficult for the organization to feel like the time they were spending each week, particularly as it literally pertained to their calendar, was aligned with the most important objectives of the organization. So there'd be every quarter these OKRs that would roll out, and even just the process of understanding who was working on what was really difficult. But then the action of getting people to align their time to their most important priorities was even harder. And so I think really broadly speaking, Reclaim's mission is making it so that your time is aligned to what's most important. And that means that what you're doing in the next minute should align up with what you want to be doing in the next few hours, next few days, next few weeks, next few months, and quarters and years. And so literally what the product does is it helps you to automate your schedule around the things that are most important to you, whether those are heads down tasks or routines you want to get time for, or meetings that you have with people that you want to make sure are getting scheduled and rescheduled as things come up.
I've been using Reclaim since just about the very beginning, and it's been interesting to see how the product has evolved. And especially, I was very impressed with how you started out and iterated on the product. I see lots of startups at all sorts of different stages. And I guess I would say one mistake I see a lot of startups make is that they have an idea of what their product is going to be. And then they basically place one bet of what that product's going to be. And there was a way that you explored the space and tested so many different ideas that I thought was really different than a lot of what I've seen. And I guess I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like how you approached it, especially in the early days, and how that's changed as the company has developed and as the product has developed.
I can jump in on that. And it's worth saying, we're still exploring and iterating. It's definitely a never-ending journey for us. Picking up where Henry shared our origin story, we very literally, in our very first kind of prototype, which I think you also had access to, but I can't. I think you were like literally like user 1 or 2. Yeah. But the very early prototype of Reclaim was a very literal manifestation of some of our ideas. It was declare your priorities, tag all the events on your calendar against those priorities, and then there was a big hand waving exercise. And then Reclaim will go optimize your schedule according to your priorities. And that was our dream. That was our vision. 5 years later, we have not achieved that dream, and we're still working towards it. But we went through that journey you're describing, always with it in mind, even when the first prototype was like a big fail. And to explain what I mean by it being a big fail is we built the prototype, we put it in front of a bunch of different users, including you and dozens of other people. And it became clear very quickly that it didn't really do anything useful, and it wasn't going to engage our users. And in some cases, it actually froze our users and made them very uncomfortable. When you ask someone, what are the most important things for you to work on? That's like a big, heavy question. And it's like, hey, welcome to this new fun thing. Let's get serious. It just really froze them up. And we internalized that. I can't say we have some superpowers or anything like that. We just took it very seriously. We're like, okay, this is not quite working. And we wanted to move quickly. So that arc of build, discover, and pivot for us was, I don't know, what do you think, Henry? 3 months in total? Like kind of September to December kind of time frame?
Yeah, from that to life work calendar, you mean? Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We tried to move pretty rapidly and then we internalized it as okay, we're not doing enough like something useful and we're not getting to some sort of action that delights the customer. What is it that we could do? Henry may have better memory than I do on why we pivoted. We knew we were going to pivot to something. We knew we
Yeah.
needed to come up with some sort of like simpler, more engaging thing. What we landed on, and Henry can fill in the gaps on how we got there because I'm forgetting a little bit. I know some of it was certainly like my lived experience. Like this is just before the pandemic and 3 kids, bit major house remodel. I was going through, I had all sorts of crazy personal scheduling stuff going on. And that was also going through all of our joint time at New Relic as well, and how personal schedules and work schedules clash and can create tension. But for whatever reason, we landed on solving that problem. And our reasoning was, look, if you're trying to move, if your North Star is aligning calendars to priorities, there's one major priority in the life of every person who works in a corporate environment, and that is their personal priorities, the things that they're obligated to do to support their family, to spend time with their kids, their spouse, errands, all that kind of stuff. And in this modern world, it intersects with your work schedule. Of course, pandemic and post pandemic, even more so. We just set that original vision on the side and said, we'll come back to that, but let's go do something useful and simple to just engage and get users onboarded. Henry, do you recall the reasoning for why we picked that thing to pivot
I,
to and
I,
our
I not
journey?
only remember the reasoning, I remember the exact moment and
See, there we
conversation we
go.
were having. We went to Popeyes and got chicken sandwiches. And on the way back from Popeyes, we were talking about, we had been running these surveys of the 30 or 40 people. I think, Jade, I'm certain you were one of them.
I'm pretty sure.
We were running these surveys and asking people like, how useful is this? And what are you finding enlightening about it or not? And we kept coming back to like really two things. One was, we're trying to change behaviors that I think for people are very entrenched. And some people, like, I remember, Jade, you were like probably one of the most advanced calendar users at New Relic. Like you had the whole philosophy around how you managed your calendar. You had a philosophy around how you color coded it. You had a concept of different types of time blocks that I seem to remember, maybe like rocks and pebbles, or maybe I'm making that up.
That's right.
And so anytime you're trying to drive behavior changes, you have to start with little nudges and you have to do things that are really low friction, really easy to understand and internalize. And I think we came back to just like, this needs to be a thing that takes action on your behalf, and to get people comfortable with the notion of taking action on your behalf in a space that they are very used to managing themselves and having complete control over. You need to start with, what is the most boring job that someone does, the least value adding job that they do right now on their calendar? And the thing we came to, and actually Patrick taught me about this problem. I didn't even know this problem existed on calendars, which just shows why we're so well paired as founders. But he was describing the calendar sync problem of just, there's this really stupid problem. You have an event on your personal calendar. It doesn't show up on your work calendar. It doesn't block out for other people unless you invite them to it, and then you lose privacy. And so there's this like tension around it. And people hire like EAs to go, a decent chunk of their time goes into like literally just blocking events across calendars and keeping them up to date. So it was one of those, wow, this is a really easy gateway into kind of, in a good way, tricking people into starting to invest in this idea of a thing that takes action on your behalf on your schedule and does a job that you probably have no strong opinions about, or if you do have strong opinions about it, they probably match this philosophy pretty easily, which is, I want the time blocked off. I don't want everyone to know exactly what I'm doing in my personal life, but I want them to know that I have something personal that shouldn't be overbooked. And that was how we got our first 4,000 or 5,000 users came through just that feature. And it was, as you probably recall, it was under this like sub brand that we had built out called Lifework Calendar, lifeworkcalendar.com. You can still go to it. It goes to our website now, but you can find it on Product Hunt. And it was really that, I think, insight around action that got us to even things like habits. You might recall that habits originally was a thing called Lunch Buddy. And again, it was starting with that idea that we weren't even trying to go build a platform for routines. We were trying to go solve the problem of, how do you get people lunch every day? And so it was this like hard-coded time policy, but you can see the genesis of habits in there that was like, I want to eat lunch sometime between 11:30 and 2 p.m. And that was where we first incorporated this concept of like flexible and adaptive time blocking for your routines. So it was really about moving up that ladder of like, what jobs can we do and how can we take on more and more jobs that people are doing, starting with the most boring kind of value adding but not super strategic ones, up to those really strategic and important jobs that people are trying to do on their schedules.
I love that. I'm curious, both of you have had a lot of experience leading product in the past, have been involved with previous companies. I think, Patrick, you've had a couple of previous successful companies. How did you approach Reclaim differently than other roles that you've done in the past?
I would say the connection to the customers has been a stable passion and thread through the entire journey of our business. From those early interviews with you to launching on Product Hunt and getting a few thousand users, we always made ourselves available. And it doesn't mean that's the only way to do it. Certainly there are successful companies that it's almost impossible to talk to someone over there and they still have found some wonderful product market fit and they are a rocket into the sky. For us, I think it was a combination of, we were doing some stuff that was pretty novel. Like there's not to knock any product out there in the world, but in fact, they actually have a really great engaged community, but like a product like Linear, it's an established market, a really established market. And so you can come in with a really strong opinion of what you want the user experience to be like. And they've done a ton of wonderful things. We big Linear fans internally, but you didn't really need to talk to a lot of people, I'm guessing, especially in the early days, to build that wonderful product. But like in our space, there's no market. Like it's not even a defined category. So I think to some degree we needed to do it. It was like our lifeline to understanding our emerging market. And then I think to some degree it's just natural. Like Henry and I both just naturally enjoy connecting with customers and really deeply understanding their experience. I'd say it's a testament to Henry's time in the field and doing go-to-market work in addition to product management and design work. And then my own experience, both as an engineer and as an entrepreneur and product manager, where deep customer empathy really serves you well because you can short circuit a whole bunch of PRDs and design docs and MRDs and whatnot just by really understanding that user and getting your hands on a keyboard. So we carried that with us and we still do. I mean, we spend way too much time in our support chat, probably because A, our product's not as high quality as we'd like it to be, and B, we haven't figured out how to like really scale things up. But whenever we're in doubt on that, we always err towards, even if we're not executing perfectly, we'd rather keep that connection alive than risk losing that connection. And that's from life work calendar to lunch buddy to habits to tasks, like every leap we took in our platform came from lots of conversations with customers.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that. I think, Henry, I think it was you that posted on LinkedIn fairly recently about how you both do support today.
Yeah.
I've personally experienced that. If I've noticed little things or I want to provide some sort of feedback, I'll click the little thing in the lower right corner and it'll pop up and I'll type in my feedback. And then usually within a few minutes, one of you writes back and says, "Oh, that's great. Thank you. Appreciate it." And that level of connection with customers, I think, is pretty rare.
We put chat in the product really early. I remember having one of these conversations, Patrick, in the early days where we said, this is a tricky space. This is a tricky problem. Let's try to use the fact that we're a really small company to our advantage and get really, really close to all of our users. I think a kind of unexpected benefit of that, to Patrick's point, is that you end up doing a lot more shipping because you feel a lot more confident that when you ship, you're going to hear something about it really quickly and you're going to learn really quickly. And, for better or worse, nothing drives urgency to go figure stuff out like having something in production and realizing like, okay, now it's out there. We got to go figure stuff out. And obviously we want to make sure things are at a minimum. We have a bar before things go out there. But anytime we're really stuck or feeling like, man, we're so close and yet so far on this launch, One of the best ways, I think, and our team really embraces this too, because I think they really love hearing instantly from users how things are affecting them or making things better, making things worse. A really good way to dislodge that is actually to just get it out to some number of people. You don't have to like shoot yourself in the foot and get it out to everybody if you really have doubts, but even just getting it out to a few hundred people and getting that feedback really quickly. And those relationships track over time. You build so much more confidence with people when they know that there's like a team behind the thing that they're using. So yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I think that's been really the biggest kind of continuity there. And I used to think a whole bunch of different ways when we were working on this, that if I could go back in time and be a product manager at New Relic again, I probably would have asked very, very different questions and spent my time on very, very different things, knowing what I know now, or just having the experience that I've had now. But, some of that is also big company, small company, it is what it is. But that definitely has been in my head quite a bit as we've been going on this journey.
That's so interesting. I'm curious for both of you, how have you grown as leaders building a company? Like what have been the biggest growth areas for you both?
I'll give it a try, and that we may have different answers. I'm guessing we do have different answers. I will say for me personally, and I don't know how much you attribute it to the startup itself, the business, the people around you, including Henry. And certainly a lot of it is that. And then a lot of it is also life circumstances. When I was getting started at New Relic, I had one newborn. And by the time I was finished there, I had 3 kids. And then I jumped right into this startup plus like a big remodel project. And that was like lots of like personal stresses. And along the arc of my startup, I had mother-in-law with Alzheimer's come and live with us. And we had a pandemic, which is tough for everybody, but especially so with kids. And so like, for me, if I could summarize everything into one thing, I'd say slowing down a little bit and having a little more patience for everyone around me and a little more patience with myself. I think those who worked with me at New Relic know that there was a number of times where I was fairly impatient and often was looking upward in the management chain and saying, okay, where are we moving faster? Where are we making these decisions? Come on. And looking back, I feel like I wish I had a little more empathy and tolerance and patience. And I look at my relationship with my manager, Jim Gochi, our old chief product officer. And I think he exercised a lot of patience, both with his team, like people like me who are yapping up at him, as well as maybe his own frustrations with his own management team at times. But I think he was at a certain stage in his career that I've grown to appreciate a little bit more. I think it's also easier when there's nobody to blame above you either to have more of that empathy. So for me, that's probably my biggest takeaway is just being more forgiving and understanding to myself and the people around me, and slowing down and understanding that like a few good decisions at the right time is ultimately more valuable than a lot of reactive, hyperactive response to the issue of the day, whatever it may be. But that's my 2 cents. Henry, what did you learn?
I actually was going to say the same thing. But I learned it all from you. So it's good to know you were learning it too. I think Patrick has this really remarkable quality that I've actually benefited a lot from, because I'm also maybe why we get along well, is we're both fairly impatient, let's go kind of people. But I think the way I like to explain it is that I think, Patrick, you have a really good sense of when to stop white knuckling a situation. Like there is a point where you can push on something and push on something and push on something. And it not only is not going to get any better the more you push on it, it's actually probably going to get worse despite your best intentions. And sometimes like time needs to run its course. And there have been innumerable situations from hiring to product stuff to investor stuff to all sorts of like moments in this business where I've definitely been like, this is super fucked up. We have to make this better right now, and let's go, or we can't stop. We have to keep going, and we have to do this and that. And there have been these moments where I think actually Patrick has been really helpful in saying, I don't know if this is going to get better until it just gets better or doesn't. Whatever is going to happen is going to happen, and And I think that's actually been a really helpful thing in life in general. I think that's a good philosophy to have that I've not been super good about carrying in the past. But also, I think especially you learn that even in a really small company where in theory, things can move infinity fast. Sometimes there's just so many variables you just can't control and aren't going to change until you let things play themselves out.
And there's a fine line, I think, between having the confidence that you'll work it out and just being aloof.
Totally.
Yeah.
And mismanaging the situation.
Yeah.
And I can't say I can prescribe how to ride that edge. But there is an art and a value, I think, to having some chill.
Yeah, I can tell you one lesson I still have not learned, and I'm probably destined to keep relearning forever, which is every single feature and every single project, no matter how easy you think it is, harder than you think it is. This is like a running joke or theme in Reclaim land. Oh yeah, that's like a 1 to 2 day project. Like we will knock that out so fast. And I would say maybe 1 out of 100 times, maybe we're right, sort of. Although usually we discover we missed something even then. But it is truly unbelievable how much, especially as your product grows and matures and your customer base grows and matures, just even in a small team, even in a startup, you can pull the thread on something really small and realize you're forgetting about like 15 other things that are going to be affected by you making that decision. So yeah, that's one I'd like to say I did differently, but I pretty much just learned it over and over again with the team.
That's great. Can you tell me a little bit about what it's been like to bring on other leaders into Reclaim and how you work with the other leaders?
Well, geez, Henry, I think you should share the relationships and techniques for people we didn't have a prior working relationship with, who turned into really critical leaders for our company along the way. I'm thinking, obviously, our head of design. We've got an amazing front-end engineer that Henry had a personal relationship with, but hadn't done a lot of deep in the trenches actual development work. And then a head of marketing as well, was transformational to our business. I will just say we're also really lucky to bring on 3 people over the 4, actually. Now I forgot Stuart's also in that mix too. But 4 people from New Relic, our time at New Relic, that were all fantastic leaders we already had a relationship with. And can't say a lot about that other than my advice is when you meet someone that you work with, don't let that relationship go, even if you don't work with them anymore. And even if you can't recruit them to your thing the first time or the second time or the third time, it pays off because these people will be really valuable to you. And I don't just mean the financial or the successful side of things, but like life's too short to work with people that you don't enjoy working with. And so if you find those people, keep them close and try to find ways to work with them. And so we were very lucky to bring on Greg and AJ, 2 product leaders that Jade, who spent many years at New Relic and at different times led big chunks of the engineering and the product organization, as well as Stuart, who led the entire customer success organization at New Relic, and Steven, who originally joined the company as one of the very first product managers, but then decided he wanted to go back into his roots and do more DevOps and InfoSec related work. And we were very lucky to bring him on board. And all of these people were people that we stayed in touch with. And for example, in Greg's case, I had been trying to work with Greg for literally 20 years. And I will continue. I recruited Greg to my very first startup shortly after I met him while working at Jive Software, the company I moved to Portland for. I left that company and I said, Greg, I'd love for you to be my co-founder. And that didn't work out. Got really close, but I never lost that. And it was part of my outreach for bringing him to New Relic. And again, took several years, but to get him on board at Reclaim. So all I would say, this isn't exactly the answer to your question about executive teams. What is an executive team if not people that you have deep trust and relationships with that you can lean on to run the most critical parts of your business? And yes, you can hire those people off the streets or through your network, but nothing replaces the lived experience of working with those people. And so when you meet those people, stay in touch is the best advice I can offer. That said, we did find several really amazing leaders that we hadn't worked with before. And I think Henry can speak to some of those experiences because they had a range of startup and non-startup experience, and they all had to adapt accordingly.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the theme with whether we're talking about Katie, who we hired very early on to lead design, or Christy, who leads marketing, and as Patrick alluded to, you can look at, I mean, basically any chart, any go-to-market chart in sort of Reclaim, and like literally see the moment that Christy joined and track everything after that. And then on the support side, folks like Kay. And I think the thing with being a startup, I think, is that your goal is to hire as many leaders as possible and actually maintain a fairly flat organization while doing so. And that's tricky because people typically who are quote unquote qualified to be leaders have held leadership roles, or you would think that on paper. In certain cases, like our head of sales role that Stuart took on, we went through 2 hires that didn't work out that were both IC account management folks. And it wasn't any sort of knock against them. I think it's that it's really challenging to step into a role that's completely undefined, where there's no defined go-to-market motion, and it just doesn't match the day-to-day reality of an IC and a 100-person sales team or something like that. So the challenge for us has always been, how do you find people who are at the right stage of their career and the right stage of their life and the right stage of seniority and have the right sort of attitude and ambition and ego to want to take on a role where they're not necessarily going to have a title or a team that reflects leadership, but where they very much are having to play a leadership role. And I think we've been continually surprised. In certain cases, like Stuart, it was like it made perfect sense. Stuart's done this type of role for 20 years. In the case of, I'll just take like Kay as an example. Kay's worked in customer support roles before, but before he came to Reclaim, Kay delivered newspapers. Kay was like a late night delivery dude. And we had actually gone through someone who had been with us previously, who had a really amazing resume, had been at major public companies as an early support hire. And I'd say the biggest difference with how Kay, I think, showed up was that he just was this like relentlessly curious, ambitious, like really just like a sponge. AJ describes it as like Moneyball people. Like we look for folks who actually get maybe passed over on leadership, wouldn't be thought of as leaders on paper, but they have this just unbelievably like amazing intelligence and this kind of just spirit of they get their hands dirty, they carry the water, all that good stuff. And so I do think it's been maybe the one lesson I've internalized from all this is that sometimes you hire someone who has the experience that you'd think of on paper makes sense. And then sometimes you hire folks, and I'd say more often the leaders we've hired on the team have surprised us. The people that we expected to be the leaders sometimes were not the people that ended up being actually the leaders that we needed. And the people who we were, this person's a really solid IC performer, end up being these people who just really, really surprise you in a really good way. So that's been an interesting experience.
How have you set up your executive team or your leadership team? I'm always curious about like how the interface between the founders and the other leaders you bring in, like how you set that up.
I would say not very intentionally. We're small enough that for the most part, everybody talks to everybody. We have a small, very shallow org chart that's like 2 layers and that's it, and make ourselves available. Henry and I connect with individual engineers on any given project, and we keep it very, very project oriented. Mm-hmm. The reality is I would say we do not do your classic management. Let's do the one-on-one and talk about your career goals and whatnot. It's not to say we didn't have those conversations from time to time, typically more so with someone that was a little earlier in their engineering career. But for the most part, it was always about the work. And that's probably an anti-pattern in classic management, corporate management lessons, but it kept the work. We heard earlier, like we're very deeply focused on the customer experience, the iteration of always improving the customer experience. And by making it always about the work, politics and drama and anything peripheral to the work and the customer just fell the wayside. And the people on our team would naturally self-select. Either they'd stick with us because that was what drove them to, and very low drama, focused on the work, or they would select out, and that's okay too. It wasn't the right environment for them. I'd say to Henry's point, like we became a gravity for that style of work, and that doesn't mean everyone can be a leader in the classic sense, but if everyone's all on the same mission of help the customer out, you start to see the people who elevate slightly above that, because you start seeing both the ability to be strategic in how you spend your time and layer in the right tactics to do it. Riffing on Kay again for a little more, an example of, yes, answer the support tickets and interweave in there scaling like macros and workflow automations and bot automations, but don't necessarily drop everything and just work on that. It's this ability to never lose sight of every day we had to deliver a service, and that includes, in his case, the customer service as well.
That's great. Is there anything about the company that you think is a little unusual, or other examples of things that are contrary to conventional wisdom in the way that you operate things?
We don't really do planning. That's kind of a weird thing. We did for a period of time, and then we stopped doing it. And I don't know that we ever intentionally said we're going to change it and replace it with this thing or make some process change. I think we all collectively realized it wasn't actually serving a valuable purpose for us. I do not think this is something that would have scaled had we or were we to go out and raise a lot more money and hire hundreds more people. I'm sure there'd be changes to how we think about this. But I think because we operate on really fast deploy, get feedback, fix stuff, make stuff better. If something's not working, it's the fastest thing is for us all to get together and talk about it and see what we want to do. Working in really small, fairly autonomous teams, I think we realized that we would go through these planning sessions every 2 weeks, and what we'd end up delivering at the end of those 2 weeks would usually be really different. Not wildly so, but it was having a North Star of the 3 or 4 goals we're trying to achieve next week was the level that made the most sense for people and helped them to at least orient themselves into the following week. But yeah, we stopped probably about a year or more ago. We stopped doing biweekly planning. We operate technically in 2-week sprints, and we have demos every 2 weeks because we really love that. And I think our team really loves that. We also do all company demos, which is a thing you can only do when you're a small company, but marketing demos, what they're doing. And,
I love that.
Steven, who's the sole operations person, will demo different stuff he's doing for developer toil. And then the engineers will demo. For a period of time, we had support demoing as well, talking through customer cases and things like that. That's another one of those things we couldn't do as we scale. But that's another area that I really enjoy because it's just a ton of fun to give engineers insight into what marketing's up to and vice versa. And it just kind of lets everyone show off what they've been doing.
I love that, especially when you contrast that with the all hands, where each of the departments is giving you some boring updates that nobody's paying attention to.
Yeah.
A demo is actually a much easier to engage with format in a lot of ways. You can see what everybody is actually doing. So one of the things that I thought would be very challenging about the space that you're in is you're dealing with all of these APIs, and it seems like it would be a really brittle and challenging thing to engineer around. How has that been, creating a company around this very strange intersection of APIs, and what has that been like for your company?
You are correct that it's a pain in the ass. We integrate with Google, now Microsoft, we're in private beta for, as well as Slack, Zoom, Jira, ClickUp, Asana, Linear, Todoist. Did I miss any, Henry? That might be it. Google Tasks.
Yeah, Google Tasks, I think, too.
Yeah. And more will be coming. And I certainly would say we did not fully appreciate what we were getting into by any means. In the very early days, even in that first prototype I mentioned earlier, we were struggling with trying to figure out how to use the Google Calendar API, but it didn't feel like this was any sort of serious architectural challenge. It felt a lot more like, okay, Lightbody, you haven't coded in a long time, dust off those cobwebs. But as time went on, it became more apparent that there were like really fundamental state challenges. In our case, we're in the business of tracking state from, say, third-party project management systems like Jira, and then processing that state and other kind of configurations the users made and doing something about it, in this case, scheduling things on their calendar, and then trying to persist that state out to the calendar. And oh, by the way, that might work or it might not. The calendar backend might be unavailable. It might be rate limiting us. It might have changed, which it does. Just last June, Google made some subtle but really critical changes that we had to adapt to, and it had fairly negative customer impact in terms of the quality of the experience. We did not fully appreciate the kind of architectural challenges and anticipate the proper architecture. And honestly, I think that was a good thing. Like, I think if we had appreciated it, we wouldn't have shipped as fast as we did. We would have said, oh, we need to build in this intermediate, layer that abstracts away from Google Calendar and is eventually consistent. And that would have been our first year of business. And we wouldn't have launched, I think in our first year, we actually launched like 3 or 4 major features and got 10,000 plus users. You hear it, it's cliched, but like shipping is more important than almost anything else. There are occasionally moments where it's a time and a place to re-platform and to re-architect. Frankly, in our 5 years, we haven't seen it yet. I'd say with our Outlook support, we are pretty close. But even that, we built it. We've got dozens of users on it now, and we're already seeing things that are like, oh, that's not the right architecture. And we're saying no to the opportunity to say, let's go pencils down and redo the architecture. We're like, no, let's just keep shipping and then we'll retool as we scale it up. And that's a skill set and a judgment and a culture all at once. Like it's all of those things, and it takes the whole team to reinforce each other. Because I've certainly had my moments where I'm like, oh God, we really got to go pencils down. And whether it's Henry or another engineer, we had an engineer who was the second engineer ever at New Relic join us for a period of time.
I remember that.
Jade has worked with this person, and he's probably one of the very best at let's ship 10 things today.
Yeah.
Even if they're like 3 lines of code change, just get it out there. And I say I learned a ton from him in that process of that hyper iterative approach. And for anyone who's in the engineering track listening in, I mean, this person, Jade can attest to it, was like literally the most senior person at New Relic. I don't know what the most distinguished senior title you can get, but it's like the top level. And at the same time, this was not someone who'd go and draw on a whiteboard. This is like, let's just get things shipping and make it better little by little. And that's hard. Sometimes it's hard to measure your progress. It's hard to feel like you're making a difference. But for us, that really helped a lot. But along the way, we had third-party dependencies break down in 100 different ways. And we always met the moment by asking the question, what can we do today that'll make it a little bit better? And that helped a lot.
Well, I have to say, as a customer of Reclaim, knowing what you're building upon, I've always been surprised how solid everything has been. Like my experience actually as a customer has been quite solid. I think that's pretty remarkable considering what to me seems like a very shifty platform you're building upon. It reminds me a little of how Netflix built upon this kind of unstable platform of AWS at the time was totally unreliable in the early days. And yet they made a very solid product on top of it.
A very practical example of that, rather than say architect the super amazing, eventually consistent Uber platform, partly because for various times of our company's existence, we didn't even have the skill set to do it. But even when we did, we almost always chose to do things that were, I'd say, much more pragmatic. Like, okay, rate limits happen, API calls fail. You can certainly try to build a durable, resilient system that retries those. You could also build a system that just runs a repair and an audit once a night and looks for deviations between what it should be and what it is. And so in this case, what's the difference between what's in our database and what's in Google Calendar? Or if you're using our calendar sync feature, the thing that does that life work kind of synchronization. It's like, oh, do you have events on your personal calendar that should be on the work calendar that aren't? Do that twice a day. And it's not the most beautiful, efficient way to do it, But what was nice about it is it gave us a safety net. It was a place where we could do our stunts and feel like it's okay to fail. And worst case, the problem will resolve itself in 12 hours or 24 hours. And so as a result, it also, I can guarantee you there have been more than a few bugs on your calendar over the years, but many times you wouldn't notice it and it would be fixed before you did. And so is that the most beautiful architecture to retry and recompute a bunch of stuff every night? No, but we're at over 500,000 users and hundreds of thousands of daily and monthly active users. And like, it's still scaling and it's still working. And so I don't think we regret any of that. And I would say my advice to anyone listening as they think about their own architectures is definitely do not shy away from simple approaches for as long as you can.
The other side of this, though, that's also pretty interesting beyond even just the architecture of it is I don't think we really understood how much education we were going to have to do for people on how Google Calendar works.
Oh, interesting.
I think you have this problem, honestly, in a lot of different markets. It's hard to understand what the level of maturity is that you're building for. At New Relic, you could have this stratified expectation of like, there's a base understanding of what monitoring is or what an agent is or how telemetry works or something like that. I think we really overestimated how much people understood some of the core concepts in Google. Even things like what is a shared calendar? What's a primary calendar? What's a recurring event versus a non-recurring event? What's a free event and what's a busy event? These not like super hidden, but things people just never touch on their calendars because they're these kind of old systems we just use. And companies typically don't do like training sessions for people on calendars. They don't even show you how to use the bells and whistles in the calendar, much less best practices on how to calendar the right way. And so a decent chunk of our customer support in the early days and even today, and actually a lot of the things we've had to build into the product and our help documentation has been partly about helping people to actually understand the concepts that we take advantage of in the calendar that we're doing potentially more sophisticated things with. But in order to even just understand those things, you have to know like, what's a free event? What's a busy event? What does it mean for an event to be recurring? What does it mean for an event to be on your primary versus on a shared calendar that other people can't see? So that's this other really funny byproduct of building around this that, again, I think if we had known about it, we probably would have shipped a lot slower maybe. And in some ways, it was probably a good thing that we didn't really know that in the early days.
So it sounds like your advice for founders is don't know anything that would prevent you from getting started.
Don't overthink it.
Yeah, don't overthink it. Yeah, just dive right in.
That's great. Yep. It's funny, you called me an advanced Google Calendar user or something, but I can think of at least one or two things I learned from Reclaim about how to use Google Calendar. So that's actually kind of interesting.
I do want to add one thing. Fully aware, we're a successful startup. We made it through year one. We had millions of dollars in ARR. We had a nice mid-sized team. Things are going great for us. We're not like right now on path to IPO anytime soon. There are certainly startups that have done better, and there are many, many that have ceased to exist. And I do want to acknowledge when I say don't overthink it, I don't want that to come off as glib, because the reality is there is a survivorship bias in everything we're saying. I think the difference is, though, it's hard to know for sure, but if our startup had fizzled out a couple years later, I don't think I'd have any regrets about how we operated and how we approached it. It just would have meant it wasn't the right time. And perhaps we failed in some way to execute, and we did, I'm sure, in a number of other ways. Sometimes it's the right place, the right time, the right market, the right vibe and aura you've got around your brand and even your own personality as a founder. And I would just say to anyone listening who's either thinking about doing a startup or has done one, and if it hasn't been successful, that shouldn't be a reason to necessarily retool everything about you. Be introspective, but also recognize there's a ton of stuff outside of your control that could lead to why it didn't work out.
I really appreciate that. I think a lot of podcasts, you see this kind of like glorification of the survivors, essentially. So there's this survivor bias and this trumpeting all the things that they did that made it all work. So I appreciate you calling that out. I really want to thank you both for your time today.
Thank you, Jade.
Yeah. Thank you.